So for the next talk, we've got Emily Hana, who's a multimedia artist working in painting, screen print, and installation. Here's Emily.
Hello. Hi. Oh, don't. You'll make me nervous. Number one, thank you so much for having me. My name is Emily Hana. I am an artist currently living and working in Hackney Wick in London. I've been in the area for about 5 years and have kind of used that time to explore my practice further. My practice is centered predominantly around printmaking, painting, sculpture, and installation. And while the focus has been on sort of painting for the last year, I kind of go through stages where I focus on different things. So here we are. My work is loosely centered around the idea of light as a physical medium or a physical object. I look at it as an indicator of space and a way to explore space. So how it changes how we interact with space and move within it, as well as changing our physical perception of what space is and how we emotionally engage with it. So essentially, I like the idea of you've got an object in front of you, and it's not just a physical object, but it is an object and its shadow counterpart, which is just as much of the original object as the physical thing itself, if that makes any sense. Lately, the work that I've been producing has been centered around gentrification, specifically focusing on warehouse culture and Hackney Wick, which is where I've been living. Let me go back. So I've been looking at gentrification in my local area, basically the way that it has worked in Hackney Wick and the way that it seems to me that it happens in most areas is that you have these areas of big industry that are, quite cheap to rent, and you have a massive influx of artists into the space, and they kind of work on building it up, creating culture, and making an area more desirable, I suppose. And then once the artists have come through, then you have people wanting to visit, and then you get the developers who will buy up the lands, jack up the prices, make it too expensive for artists to actually live there. So the artists get pushed out, and you end up with Shoreditch. So I've kind of experienced that firsthand living in Hackney Wick, which I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it, but it was, before the Olympics here, the highest density population of artists in Europe. And now it's just like a small group of us that are still kind of clinging on and trying to make it a fraction of what it once was. And I think we're doing a decent job considering what's happened to the area. It's interesting because, I moved over to Hackney Wick in 2016, 2017. And I had some fairly intense experiences with gentrification. Basically, I moved into this studio space where I was trying to work, and we were trying to stop the developers from getting a hold of the space. And so we were basically living in this building that was being demolished while we were in it. Like, we didn't have an exterior wall. There were, big machines like tearing it down. And we were kind of locking ourselves in there, trying to keep working and keep it going. It failed, but It was an experience. It was an experience. So I'll circle back to that in a moment, but basically, I suppose where my professional journey started was I was a teacher in Australia. I was a teacher for about 4 or 5 years. Art, high school teacher. I liked it, and it's something that I thought I really wanted to do, but if I'm being completely honest with myself, I've wanted to be an artist since I was about 5 years old. And in Australia, growing up there, you don't see many artists, so I didn't think that it was something that was accessible to me, or a path that I was able to go down. Like, you had to have money if you wanted to be an artist in Australia, basically. It's not like here where your government actually kind of supports you a little bit, which is nice. So I started teaching. I did a couple of exhibitions in Australia in my spare time, which is when I started working with these sort of installation sculptural forms, and started playing with light. Yeah, so this was a part of one of my first solo shows in Australia, where I basically took these folded paper structures that I developed from a concertina book structure. I was quite into bookbinding when I was a kid, and I kind of blew them up and joined them together, and they tessellate quite nicely, and I really liked the way that they disjointed light. Yeah, so I was kind of exploring that. I don't think necessarily the ideas were fully formed at that point, but it's something that I explore even today, and I feel like I've pushed that boundary a little bit more. I also created this massive sculpture. It was about this size, based on that same structure. It was made from plywood, but it was foldable. So I didn't want to include hinges or anything like that, so I developed this way of creating a hinge from fabric, where you get 2 pieces of plywood and you glue canvas in between and kind of sandwich it, and it acts as a hinge. So it was just as movable as the small paper pieces that I was working on, but I think in a more substantial way, if that makes sense. Unfortunately, this piece doesn't exist anymore. It had to be thrown out when I left Australia, but it will be created again at some point. And then, oh yeah, so this is the paper structure that I based most of my earlier work off. And then I got into projection mapping. So it's the same piece exhibited in another exhibition in Sydney. Yeah, what's that? Is that gonna play? Yeah, and I projection mapped over the top to kind of play with light and space and see if I could make the work a little bit more interesting and interactive. It was, I think, more of a experiment than anything, but I really liked the result of it. It also taught me about projection mapping, which I had no idea about until someone who I think was trolling me on Instagram commented, "Dude, haven't you ever heard of projection mapping?" To which I was like, "No, would you teach me?" And it actually worked out quite well. Yeah, so that was just a photo of me learning how to map that piece using MadMapper. I'm not going to lie, I'm not great with technology. It gave me a little bit of a breakdown. It is difficult. So then from that point, I was working in Australia as a teacher. I was kind of dissatisfied with my job, as well as I'd been in an abusive relationship for a couple of years, and I needed a way to kind of get away from all of that and leave Australia. So I applied for an artist residency in Amsterdam at Overtoom 301, OT 301, and I was accepted, and I booked a one-way ticket, and I left all of my stuff in Australia, and I ran away. And honestly the best decision I've ever made. I got to Amsterdam and I was, for the first time kind of doing my art full time, really, really happy. I was just folding paper constantly and doing like bits of drawing and visiting galleries. And then one day I decided to go to this club. It was my first clubbing experience. I was quite sheltered in Australia. And I ended up at this place called The School, which is like, I think it was originally an abandoned high school that they've turned into this club, but it's not only a club, it's also got a 24-hour art gallery. And at the time, there was a collective there called Children of the Light, who are a Dutch collective. They work with light. Their work is incredible. Highly recommend looking it up. And they were doing a residency there and had some incredible installations up. So I went to this club and ended up spending most of the time in the gallery space, just looking at their work. And I was so impressed with it that I got home first thing in the morning, and before going to bed, I emailed the club and I asked them if I could make an installation for them. And I don't know why, but they said yes. And this is what I produced. So it was 1,400 pieces of paper, individually folded to create this massive 6-meter cloud. It doesn't necessarily look as big in this image. I wish I had more photos, but it's been a long time and I've lost them all. But yeah, so 1,400 pieces of paper with 2 projectors, projection mapping, a recording of the light in Amsterdam over a 24-hour period. Another thing about moving to Amsterdam was I fell in love with Dutch light. As I'm sure many artists have before me. It is, I don't know what it is about Dutch light, but it is beautiful. And I had this moment when I was originally visiting De School for the first time, where it was the morning I was watching the other artists' installations and the sun was coming up. And there was light streaming through the window and it was mixing with the smoke in the club and it just turned the whole room bright pink with the sunrise and the smoke and then the light from their installation, and it was just completely magical. So I kind of wanted to, in a way, recreate that same effect with this piece. So at different times of the evening, there would be an injection of smoke into the room, and it would play with the light from the projectors. And because it was a moving image, it really kind of, there was a dance to it. And it was the first time I'd seen people interact with my work outside of a traditional gallery setting. I really loved it. Maybe it was because they were drunk, but they were all really impressed and they would just kind of lie underneath the work for hours and just stare at it. And yeah, it was quite a magical experience. And at certain points, it would turn into a performance space as well. I had a friend who came to visit me from London who's an opera singer, and just on the spur of the moment, she went into the space and she decided to do an opera performance underneath the work, which was, yeah, quite special. Then I left Amsterdam and I'd run through all of my savings. I had a lot of debt and I was sleeping under my mother's kitchen table in Hammersmith and not in a great place mentally. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know where I was going. I'd kind of moved to London without any real direction. And I fell into a real depression, I think. Creative block is something that I've struggled with a lot throughout my career, and it tends to happen after I have something that I'm really proud of that I've made. So I'll put a lot of energy into doing something and I'll be really happy with it. And then there's this little thing in my brain that goes, what if you never make anything that's as good? It's been a long process of trying to learn how to not listen to that voice and to just keep making. So I started looking at some other artists who really influenced my practice. Number one, Kurt Schwitters, absolutely love his work. This was his house, and it is my dream home. But his work really informs my sculptural work, which you'll sort of see in later slides. But basically, he has this idea of merts, which is essentially a nonsense word that he made up to explain how he takes things and just joins them together in a nonsense way to create something beautiful. And so he called his house his Mertzbau. Unfortunately, the original doesn't exist anymore. It was destroyed. But yeah, I'm obsessed with it. And then one of my other influences is Remnen Alexander Tako. He is an Australian Japanese artist. And the way that he approaches light in his paintings, I think, is well worth a look for any painters. He's not particularly well known. I think he definitely should be. I think his work is absolutely incredible. And so, yeah, I kind of threw myself into looking at other people's work. And then I suppose also living in Hackney Wick at that time, I was surrounded by other artists and musicians and writers. And I think seeing them work so hard on their own projects really pushed me to try something else. So I got into poetry and a little bit of writing, and I used that to kind of pull me out of my creative block. So that's one of the techniques that I've, I suppose, developed whenever I feel like I'm getting into creative block, is to work on something completely different. Recently, I've started working on furniture after my latest exhibition because I couldn't bear to pick up another paintbrush for a couple of months after a year of pretty much painting every single day. But yeah, so I got into poetry, and yeah, that really helped me. So this piece, I suppose, marks the end of my 3-year creative block. It was really difficult in that time trying to still call myself an artist when I wasn't making anything. But I think I kind of got to a point where a compulsion kind of took over and sort of showed me that I was ready to start making again. I'd never worked with wood before, and this kind of started from, I found this massive kind of 2.5 meter box out on the street next to one of the warehouses, and I made my housemate drag it home with me. And it sat in my living room for a couple of months before I started working on it. But basically, it's taken from different recycled materials from around the area. So I would go dumpster diving, or I'd find a piece of wood or a barrel on the side of the road, and I'd drag it back. You can see some of the shapes. This is half of a barrel, and then up there is the other half. I think this part here was part of a cabinet that I tore apart and then joined together. It took me about 9 months to make, and I consider it a self-portrait. Obviously not in a literal sense, but more in an abstract sense, I suppose, relating to my depression. It was basically an accumulation of things that were trash, and I tried to pull them back together and turn them into something beautiful. So I guess it was like a process of rebuilding. So it's not necessarily a self-portrait of my exterior, but it's more my guts and trying to rebuild some kind of sense of self-worth based on some fairly terrible experiences that I had had. It was also a really interesting piece to work on because I'd never worked with wood before, so it was a real test, and I had to teach myself, and I learned a lot, and I kind of fell in love with woodworking, and now it's something that I do pretty much with all of my work. Yeah, so these are a couple of 35mm photographs that I took of my work. While I was building it, I tend to do this a lot during my process, and I will then kind of take those photos and go back and use them as inspiration for paintings. So it's kind of like a cyclical thing. I make one thing, it informs the next, which informs the next, which informs the next. But yeah, it's I suppose, a nice form of documentation as well, documenting the process. Like, I've learned my lesson with digital photography. Not being great with technology, I have lost photos of a lot of my work over the years because I've lost hard drives or USBs or whatever. And I suppose having a physical copy is really helpful to me. Unless, God forbid, there's a fire or a flood, hopefully I will always have these as a record of the process. So when I moved to London, I'd been working in a bar for about a year before I found Thumbprint Editions, which is a fine arts editioning printmaking studio in South London. So I was working with Thumbprint, and I got that job. I did not think I was qualified for it, but I kind of knew that I was able to do the work if I could get my foot through the door, and I was right. So basically we were working with fairly large name artists and producing work based off their paintings, or sometimes they would come in and, you know, we'd get to work one-on-one with these incredible people to produce unique prints. And I worked there for 4 years. I still do a little bit of freelance for them. I absolutely loved it. I learned so much about printmaking. And yeah, really sort of fell in love with the process and started using printmaking for my own work. Yeah, this photo was taken when I was working with an artist called Chuck Arnoldi. He's an American artist. He kind of works mainly with sculpture and painting, very abstract work, but he was an absolute pleasure to work with. He is one of the few artists that came in and, number one, remembered my name and treated me like a person. But yeah, he worked one-on-one with us for the whole week, and we produced this amazing series of prints for him. Another artist I worked with, I was kind of in charge of his project, was Harlan Miller. This was a really interesting project to work on, and I'm still kind of working on his pieces, but we had to, as a team, develop a new form of printmaking in order to create his work. So it was like a combination of colograph, photopolymer etching, relief printing, and then kind of painting on top of these gel plates and then printing that. But like, these prints were 5 layers. They each needed a month to dry in between because the ink was so thick. And you look at them in person and they look like paintings. So yeah, it was a fairly amazing process to learn about. Yeah, actually, if anyone is interested in printmaking, I would definitely suggest trying to do some work experience with thumbprint because you'll learn a lot. So I'd been working there for a long time, and then COVID hits, and I get put on furlough. And for the first couple of weeks, I hated it. I didn't know what to do with myself because I was a bit of a workaholic. And I thought I was going to fall into another depression. Thankfully, I didn't. I found painting. And I really started exploring that. So this was one of the first painting pieces that I'd made since university, which was a long time ago. And it is painted with, it's mainly oil paints, but I also use this bitumen gutter putty. It's like this paint that's used for sealing gutters. But it's got this like really beautiful brown color to it, and then if you put it on thick, it goes like black. And then I was playing with mixing it with acrylic house paint as well, and I liked the way that the paint resisted and kind of created this really interesting kind of texture. So I started experimenting with that. I fell in love with painting. And started making these massive pieces, and people started buying them, which was strange for me because up until that point, I hadn't really made any money off my own work before. So they were like, I suppose, based off architectural forms and light, but then further abstracted. So I would start painting something, and then I'd be influenced by what was going on around me. This line here was a shadow that was coming in through the window and landing on the painting while I was working on it, and I really liked the shape, and so I kind of included it in the final painting. I was really happy with the results, although it does still kill me that no matter how much I try, I'm never going to be able to match the beauty of actual natural light, but we'll get there. We'll get there. This was a piece that I made based off the warehouse I was living in. So if you spend some time and look at it, you can see that it's 2 different images painted on top of one another. And like in some areas, I'm not sure if you can kind of see, but you've got that texture that I was talking about in combining oil paint and acrylic. I don't know, I wasn't a trained painter, so I was teaching myself, and one thing I do remember from university was they didn't necessarily give us any direction with materials, but they just said, go and make your own mistakes. And so I did, and I was really happy with the mistakes that I was making. Some of them were terrible, but some of them worked out quite nicely. So this was the warehouse that I was living at the time, Peanut Factory. And I tend to put at the time that I painted this, I was putting symbols into my work that related to what was going on at the time. I was having some issues with my housemate and best friend, and there are some symbols that kind of relate to her in this piece as well. This piece was a commission. It was like a 2-meter painting based around, again, Hackney Wick, but more the new builds in the area. And I suppose it was, I made it to make sense of the fact that I'd been living in this place for years, and I would walk around the streets and I wouldn't recognize where I was, because all of a sudden, all of these new buildings had popped up overnight. And so it's quite disjointed, and I kind of wanted to give it this feel of a labyrinth, whereby you can't quite work out how you get from one place to another, and it changes and kind of implies some kind of movement. I also got into, so I started dumpster diving more seriously, and getting my materials for free from around Hackney Wick, painting on doors that I found kind of thrown out, or this day where I found these pieces was one of the happiest days of my life. So I was climbing in this dumpster and I found these incredible pieces of wood that had metal razor blades embedded into the wood. And I looked them up afterwards, and I found out that they were originally for cutting leather. So the shapes that you kind of see going along here, that is all kind of metal embedded into the wood, and I used that to abstract the images that I was working with. Not necessarily physically, but through color. And that's something I still do now. But I was really happy with the series that I created using those pieces. I think that's what I really like about using found objects, is that they've got a history to them. You can look at them and it looks like a, polished, finished painting. But if you look closer, you can see its kind of grimy beginnings, I suppose the history of what that object actually was. This is another one that I created on a cutting block. It's got the razors still embedded in it, but this piece was probably my most popular. And so I recently turned it into a print, which I'm still selling. It's, I think, interesting going down the path of turning art into an actual career, because you have to get to a point where you need to like the work that you're making, but then you also need to listen to your audience and what people are buying and what people want from you. And so there's got to be some kind of compromise as to what kind of work that you produce. And I do produce more commercial work sometimes, but then I make sure that I have my passion projects as well on the side so that my soul is nourished. I think making things is kind of like breathing, or at least that's just my obsession. So I was on furlough for about 6 months before I got called back, and I was having some kind of success with selling my work, and I started having panic attacks every morning when I was going into work because I just didn't want to be there anymore. And one day I walked in and I quit. And from that point, I just couldn't have been happier. So I started really throwing myself into my work. It was a really scary jump to take, not having any kind of financial stability, but I think definitely worth it. I think you get to a point where it's either I'm going to do this and I'm going to put my all into it, or I need to find something else. And I kind of reached that breaking point where I decided, you know what, I'm all in. I'm doing this. And it's been a year and I'm still loving it. This is one of my favorite spaces for picking up materials. It's this abandoned, I think it used to be a warehouse, but it turned into a squat. The squatters have now been kicked out and they're getting ready to demolish the space. But there's some really good stuff there. There's some really, really good stuff there. Not just to, pick up, but for inspiration as well. Like there are whole sections of houses that just don't have roofs and, have been covered in graffiti. And I found that really interesting. So I made a series of works based off this space as well, as well as photographs. I don't have too many of those on here though, sorry. Yeah, so then I started getting into sculpture a little bit more, so working with wood. This was one of my first attempts of like a small wall sculpture, which I really enjoyed. But that kind of led towards my most recent exhibition, so Komorebi. I had this exhibition in November last year, and it was my first solo show in about 5 years. So basically, Komorebi is a Japanese word which means, number one, like a nostalgic connection to place or people that are not around you. And then also, it's a word for the way that the light diffuses through the leaves and trees. And I thought that word really related to my own work. Being born in Japan, I've kind of always felt a real connection to the place. And I think it comes through in my aesthetic a lot. But it's also something that I really want to explore more. I'm desperate to go over and work there for a period of time. But I basically created a series of works around this word, which were, hang on, will this work? Yeah, this is me dumpster diving, and then also making the sculptural canvases. I started painting on these kind of sculptural pieces because I really liked the way that they created an additional shadow in the image, and depending on the time of day, you move around it and it changes it completely. Or depending on where you're standing in a room, the image is different. So yeah, it's also just like a really lovely process. I get to work with sculpture and painting. It was something that I hadn't seen many artists do before. And yeah, it was a joy to kind of work out how to do it. So this was the first piece that I worked on where I was working with a photographic image and trying to recreate that on a three-dimensional surface. So it's light being projected through a window onto a plant, and kind of the shadows that come from that. But yeah, as you move around it changes, it becomes different. It also got me comfortable with working with an image that isn't necessarily square. I like having cutouts in my work. Like this piece, this was the one that you just saw me making the canvas for. So this piece was, I got the original image from a shadow of light that had come into my bedroom as I was leaving my last house. And so I suppose it's that kind of nostalgia, or, that feeling when you either go into a new place that you're about to move, or you've just packed everything up and you're leaving and you're looking at the empty room and it's got so many memories in it. But there's not really a physical indication of you having been there at all. And I think the thing that I remembered from that room the most was the light. So I decided to kind of paint that and fragment that through this piece. Yeah. These were some other sculptural canvases that I started working on. So this one is half of a barrel that I found. This piece up here was the backing. Actually, it was the first layer for a print that we did for an artist called Yenka Shonobare at Thumbprint. So it was basically just like a plain piece of wood that we printed as a background for one of his prints, and it was going to be thrown out, and I liked work with wood, so I asked if I could take it, and I incorporated it into my work. All of the other pieces here were bits that I either picked out from dumpsters, or there were some local carpenters around the corner from my studio, and they saw me digging through their trash regularly, and so they just invited me in to pick through their scraps. And now that's generally where I go before dumpsters, because they're cleaner. But yeah, so all offcuts, all kind of free materials. I mean, that's the other wonderful thing about working with found objects is it is either very, very cheap or very, very free. And that is the right price for me. So yeah, so this was a piece that I created on that one. It was, I suppose, about an inward journey, so kind of looking inside yourself and working through some things that I'd been dealing with. For me, the pandemic was quite insular, as I'm sure it was for a lot of people, and I had a lot of time to reflect on the way I conduct myself in the world and the way I behave around other people. And I suppose this piece is a visual representation of that exploration. This was another piece that I created on a sculptural canvas. It's called The Dance. It is based around when I was in quarantine, stuck in my bedroom. I was bored out of my mind, and I have this really beautiful light that comes through my window, and I would just spend hours kind of dancing and watching my shadow, and kind of playing with my shadow and making up games with it. I went a little bit crazy. But I suppose, yeah, this is about that. And I suppose also, you know, that sort of solitude. But I really liked exhibiting these works at this place called Open House Hackney, because, you know, the light in that space is really incredible as well. And so because my works are sculptural, they change throughout the day. If you've got like a nice beam of light coming into the room, it changes the image completely. And yeah, I think it was a really good space to explore that. These were some smaller pieces that I started working on. Kind of what I meant when I was saying I've been going into more commercial works, because obviously not everyone can afford to buy a massive painting for their house. So I started making kind of smaller, more affordable pieces, which would sell quite easily. Instagram has been my best tool. I sell 90% of my work through there. Yeah, social media is painful, but yeah, I think if you're working with a visual medium, you can't quantify how much help it is to actually get your name out there. Yeah, so I started selling some smaller pieces, which worked quite well, which was kind of funding me making the larger pieces. This was opening night at the exhibition at Komarobi. It was a really lovely evening. I was very overwhelmed. I think we had about 70 people through, which I wasn't expecting. But yeah, it was really lovely to kind of see the support from, you know, friends and people that have followed me on Instagram for a couple of years, and meet some new people as well. I recreated with the help of University of East London, my sculptural light piece that I showed you at the start. So you guys donated 1,000 pieces of paper to me, and this is what I kind of created with it. So stupidly, I decided to do this about a month before the actual exhibition. So while trying to organize the exhibition, I was folding 1,000 pieces of paper, or rather, my mother was folding a lot of this. She's a good woman. Yeah, so it turned into this massive light installation. I had a friend of mine, Max, do the projections for it, and he also performed underneath it because I found out that not only was he a professional light projection mapper person, he also released an album a couple of years ago with the same title of the exhibition, Komorebi, and so he performed that underneath the sculpture. And yeah, it was a really beautiful night. I don't remember a lot of it because it's just shaking hands. I think if you ever have a big show like that, it really knocks you out for a little while. Yeah, so this is more of the process of kind of joining the pieces together in the space. A lot of late nights on the lead up to the exhibition. Yeah, the space that I worked with, I love the building, but it was very much a DIY exhibition, so there wasn't any help or support from the gallery as to, you know, organizing vinyls for the walls or social media or, you know, installing the work. So it was a lot to do just by myself. And I think if I had the opportunity to have another exhibition in the future, I would like to perhaps look at a gallery that provides support, because it is a lot of work in order to get to that point of having a successful show. This was Izzy, the curator, and Max, who organized the projections and performed on the night. Yeah, they ended up having like a little jam after he performed his set. And yeah, that was really interesting as well. I think it's quite nice to incorporate live music into an art show, especially. I don't know, I think it relaxes people a bit. Exhibitions can be quite daunting, feeling like you have to walk around and focus all of your attention on a piece of work, but I don't know, it makes it a bit more chill. Yeah, a couple of more photos of the exhibition and the piece that I made. This was when I was taking the piece down. It had, you know, after the week started collapsing a little bit, but I quite like that process as well. I mean, it's only paper, so it's not necessarily a strong material to create massive sculptures from, but it's a process that I quite enjoy anyway, just watching it deteriorate. Yeah. Oh, this piece on the side, I don't have a proper picture of it up, but that was made from a door that I pulled out of one of the warehouses when it was getting demolished. And I started adding pieces onto it, and I ended up painting a door that was in one of the new builds that got built on the site that was originally a part of. That was quite a fun piece to work on. I like working on a massive scale, but they're very difficult to sell. So I think that's just going to be in my house for a very long time. Yeah, so after that exhibition, I kind of, for the month afterwards, felt like I needed to be really insular. It took a lot out of me. I started experiencing creative block again. which is always terrifying because the last time I really had creative block, it was 3 years long and I couldn't make anything. And now that I've turned this into my job, if I'm not making things, that's not good. So I kind of gave myself a bit of a break and I started working on making furniture, which I haven't done before. I'm just kind of vibing it out and seeing how I go with it, but I'm really loving the process. I've now taken the lease of a larger warehouse space, so I can have a much bigger workshop and yeah, really start to work on that a little bit more, I think, or at least that's what I'm hoping for. How are we going for time? Yeah, that's my social media if anyone is interested. Yes. Does anyone have any questions at all?
Questions at all?
Yes.
I wanted to ask about the paper. You know how you said you like how it was falling. Did you ever think to perhaps you trying to destroy your own sculpture or something?
I'm trying to destroy it?
No. Did you ever think about doing that, like destroying your piece of work and just and just doing something new with it?
I have thought about that. I would really like to produce one of those sculptures in like an outdoor setting.
What about burning the paper? Like the source sculpture?
It would be really cool.
And then doing something out
Fire
of it.
regulations, difficult on that. But yeah, it has been something that's popped into my head. I really like the idea of it being something that's temporary, but like you almost turn it into a performance or like a time-based work. But yeah, it's definitely something I want to explore more in the future.
And I have another question. I'm really bad with names. So what's the title of the sculpture, if it has one?
Of the paper piece?
The one that was falling apart. Or the paper one.
That one is, it's got a fairly confusing name that I came up with in Amsterdam when I was working on it originally. It's called Newton's Concerns over a wicker lamp shade and a cat. It's a bit out there. But basically I was thinking about, light and kind of how it changes our perception of space and how we kind of view it and emotionally engage with it. And so I was kind of imagining this scene of someone, with the lights off, thinking that there was monsters or people present while looking at inanimate objects, the way that light is kind of shone on those pieces. It's a bit out there. I would like to rename it, if I'm being totally honest.
Oh, yeah, that's very much.
On your creative process of the sculpture and painting, what comes first? Like the dance, you do a sketch of it, or you do the sculpture first? How does it work?
So generally I make the sculpture first. So I'll go out and find a bunch of materials. I generally don't like to recut things or change the shape of them too much. I like to work with the shapes that I come across. And then I'll spend probably my favorite part of the process, which is trying to work out how I want to configure those pieces together. And then I join it and make sure it's stable and create hanging systems so that it can actually go on a wall. And then after that, I look for an image that I can work with. Sometimes I've already got something in my mind, but generally speaking, I go to my phone where I have like a bank of images that I've taken over the last few months, and I'll slowly work my way through those to see what would actually work on that piece. A lot of the time, it's not just one image that I use to inform it, but it's a few, and it kind of gets joined together. And then, yeah, I kind of, it's a conversation with the work. I think when you're working with something that isn't a straightforward square, you need to make some concessions with the image. Like, there's this concept, I can't remember who said it, but there's this concept of let's kill our darlings. And that is, what that basically means is you have, I mean, it was originally about writing, but you have this thing that you've written, or you have this thing that you're making, or you have an image that you want to work on, and you've got your favorite things about that image, but while you're producing it, if you're working on it and that is the one thing that's not really working, what are you holding it on? What are you holding on to it for? You need to kill your darlings. You need to throw out the things that you love the most and kind of work with everything else that's working in that process. So I think, yeah, I can't be too precious about the images that I work with, because a lot of the time they're not going to end up being anything like what I set out to make it, if that makes sense.
Of the sculpture before, it's just like you're organic, you just create it and then you deal with it afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know, it's when you get into a flow state, or at least when I get into a flow state, it just kind of happens organically. So I find even if I have planned something before, the plan gets forgotten. So I don't really work with plans so much anymore. In some ways, I kind of feel like a fraud, because I'll have finished this piece and I barely remember making it or making the choices anyway. My hands are just doing it because you're so kind of involved. It's like a meditation. So yeah, I feel like I don't necessarily make my work myself. That's something else that's doing it. And then I kind of step away and I'm like, I don't know where that came from, but it's either successful or it's not. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else? No? Cool. Thank you, Emily, for coming and talking at UEL.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And cool. So the next talk will be at 2 o'clock, 2:30, and it's back in the light well. Thanks, everyone.
So I'm domestic violence survivor.